This is the final reading that we are doing in this class. And there's a reason that this one is coming at the very end. This whole time we've been talking about ethical theories, how to do moral actions, how to avoid immoral actions. But we haven't really talked about, well, what do you do when somebody does something immoral? And how can we move forward as a society in a world in which we make mistakes, in which we're fallible, and in which the consequences of our actions, if not internally, at least externally, hang over our heads? Today we're looking at the philosophy of Hannah Arendt, and this is relevant to the practice of ethics and this class generally of philosophy, because what she's going to be talking about in this book is the tools that humans need in order to keep society going in a world, as I said before, in which we're not perfect, in which we make mistakes. And so I asked you to read just a few sections from her book, The Human Condition. I think Hannah Arendt is an extremely intelligent woman, one of the most important social political philosophers of the 20th century. She was a German Jew who escaped the Nazis. And so what she's going to be saying today, I want you to keep all of this in the back of your mind, these facts about her. What she's going to be saying today has a lot of weight, and it comes from personal experience, not just philosophical analysis. She was actually in a concentration camp before she fled Europe. And so the things that she's going to be saying today about forgiveness and promise making are not abstract, and they're not disconnected from reality, but they're actually born out of her experiences in the Holocaust. And I think that says something important about the role that forgiveness and promise making can play in our own lives. If someone like that, who has suffered oppression at the hands of another group, can forgive and can still maintain hope for the future of humanity, I think we can too. Or at least I hope we can. So I'm going to begin by just providing a summary of the sections that I asked you to read for today. And then I hope we can have kind of a little discussion about the potential roles that forgiveness and promise making can play in our lives personally, as well as human society moving forward. So let's begin. Let's start by looking at chapter or section 32 of this book, the process character of action. One of the things that we have not really scrutinized in this class yet is the nature of action itself. We have discussed what it means to take a moral or an immoral action, but we haven't looked at the features of action itself and broken it down. Hannah Arendt does that in this section of the book because it is relevant to the social and political analysis that she's doing. She notes that every human has the innate capacity to bring something new into the world or to initiate a process. For her, this is known as action. We all have the ability to start things, to create things, to bring something into existence, whether that's a piece of art, whether that's poetry, whether that is a product of music production, whatever it is. And through our actions, in the private and social spheres, we also have the ability to initiate processes. Arendt wants us to conceptualize action as a process initiator, something that initiates processes on this planet that is going to have consequences that we're not going to be able to tell what they are before we perform the action. She makes a note in this book that only the historian is able to know the consequences of human action, because the historian has the privilege of being able to look backwards and do analysis of historical events and what our different actions cause in human life. So she doesn't want us to think of action as some discrete, disconnected thing, but as something that initiates a process or something that begins something. Now, actions can be wonderful, but they can also be really scary and they can be disastrous. Actions, as you know, produce consequences. But the interesting thing about these consequences is that they have particular features that escape our notice unless we look very carefully. We kind of take it for granted that we can understand the consequences of our actions, that we can know ahead of time what the consequences of our actions are going to be. Not so, Arendt says. Sure, we have experience with reckoning with the consequences of our own actions and the consequences of other people's actions, but that does not allow us to get a good enough glimpse into the nature of our actions themselves to know completely what it is that we're doing when we're acting and the effects that it's going to have on other people. She notes that the consequences that are produced by action are unpredictable. Here, we'll do this. Do a little list. That is, we can't know ahead of time the consequences that our actions are going to produce. Let's say you ran into someone as you came into the building today. You might not think very much about that, but that one interaction could play a pivotal role in that person's day, right? Perhaps it makes them have a good day. Perhaps it makes them have an awful day. Perhaps if you hadn't run into them and made them late for their class, let's say they were going to drive downtown, you prevented them from getting into a car accident without even realizing it. Our actions have consequences that we cannot fully know. They're unpredictable. In addition, because they're unpredictable, another feature of the consequences of actions are that they are not able to be fully controlled. So not only are the consequences of our actions unpredictable, but it's not like we can put them in a box and we can control what happens in the future once we act. Because action is the initiating of a process, what we end up doing when we act is we set off a chain of consequences over which we do not have absolute control. And I'm sure that you can think of examples like this in your own life. We simply don't have the knowledge or the power or the wisdom to be able to fully control what happens as a result of our actions. Our actions don't exist in a vacuum. They have consequences on ourselves and on other people. She talks about this on page 232 at the bottom. Whereas men have always been capable of destroying whatever was the product of human hands, and have become capable today even of the potential destruction of what man did not make, the earth and earthly nature, men never have been and never will be able to undo or even control reliably any of the processes they start through action. Not even oblivion and confusion which can cover up so efficiently the origin and responsibility for every single deed, are able to undo a deed or prevent its consequences. And this incapacity to undo what has been done is matched by an almost equally complete incapacity to foretell the consequences of any deed, or even to have reliable knowledge of its motives. And so she's bringing to the fore another characteristic of action here. It's not only that actions produce consequences which are unpredictable and which we cannot fully control, but that our actions are irreversible. We cannot take something back that we have done. And you know this when you just think about some of the things that you've said in your life. Right? There are things that you have said that have impacted other people that you can't take back. Wounds that you have inflicted on others that you can't heal just by saying, "Oh, I didn't mean to say that." Right? And so the actions that we take in life end up producing consequences which are unpredictable, unable to be fully controlled, and irreversible. And furthermore, our actions produce consequences which multiply as time goes on. Your action, again, does not exist within a vacuum. It doesn't just set off one chain of consequences. It sets off multiple chains of consequences. So I'm talking to you here today. I'm acting through my speech in some way. I'm having some effect on your ears, on your neurochemistry, on what you think and maybe what it is that you believe. Not only because I'm talking to more than one person, but also because you perform actions. What I say here today is going to have consequences in your lives and in my life that we cannot know. Consequences which are going to continue to multiply because you act, and my words are going to be contributory to what influences you to act in some way. This is one example in which the consequences of action can multiply themselves. What I say here is going to have some influence on you, which is going to cause you to act in certain ways, which is going to cause you to set off chains of consequences of your own, which are going to impact yourself and others in ways that you cannot know. So action can be a really scary thing. It can be a wonderful thing. We can do some amazing things by acting. We can create. We can produce art. We can comfort someone or empathize someone. We could build a city. But actions need to also be understood in their relationship to the consequences they produce. And in that way, they can be scary because they produce consequences that are unpredictable, irreversible, and not able to be fully controlled. She discusses this a little bit later in the section, later down on that page 233. That deeds possess such an enormous capacity for endurance, superior to every other man-made product, could be a matter of pride if men were able to bear its burden. The burden of irreversibility and unpredictability, from which the action process draws its very strength. That this is impossible, men have always known. They have known that he who acts never quite knows what he is doing, that he always becomes guilty of consequences he never intended or even foresaw, that no matter how disastrous and unexpected the consequences of his deed, he can never undo it. That the process he starts is never consummated unequivocally in one single deed or event, but rather that its very meaning discloses itself to the actor, never discloses itself to the actor, but only to the backwards glance of the historian who himself does not act. all of this is reason enough to turn away with despair from the realm of human affairs and to hold in contempt the human capacity for freedom, which, by producing the web of human relationships, seems to entangle its producer to such an extent that he appears much more the victim and the sufferer than the author and doer of what he does. Nowhere, in other words, neither in labor, subject to the necessity of life, nor in fabrication, dependent upon given material, does man appear to be less free than in those capacities whose very essence is freedom, and in that realm which owes its existence to nobody and nothing but man. So we are always initiating processes as we go through life. Processes that we can't control, processes and consequences that we can't foresee. If this was all we were able to do with our actions, it would soon become clear that we would not be able to bear the burden of our actions. They would incriminate us because our actions impact other people negatively in many different ways, and in ways that we cannot foresee way down the line. All of this may cause us to look upon action and human life as absurd and as unfree. But luckily, meditating on the nature of action will reveal to us a way out. Redemption from the consequences of our own actions. And Arendt talks about this in section 33. Irreversibility and the power to forgive. The consequential nature of action might cause us to despair because we realize that we are initiating processes and we are impacting people in ways that we can't foresee, in ways that end up harming others. But we have cause to be hopeful. But what we find if we meditate on the nature of action a little bit more is that the seeds of remedying the consequences of action are found within the capacity for action itself. It is hard for me to express the precise meaning of what Arendt is saying here, because it would require you to understand the other kind of analysis that she's doing in this book. So let me just offer a brief overview. Arendt is trying to describe in this book what we are doing. In doing that, what she's trying to do is outline the primary activities of human life and to show how these activities have placed us in a socio-political position in which we are living unfulfilling lives and in which we have created institutions and socioeconomic structures that are no longer serving us. She distinguishes between three primary activities of human life. There's labor, work, and action. Everybody engages in labor. Labor is everything that we do to maintain our life, our biological existence. Metabolizing food, growing and harvesting crops, chewing, raising a child. These are all examples of labor. And we have to do this in order to survive. We have certain biological necessities that need to be met. Now, what Arendt notes is that the solution, oftentimes, to the problems that we face in the sphere related to that activity are solved by the one after it. Work is another activity that we engage in. Work, for Arendt, means producing things with a goal or purpose in mind, crafting things. This would be like sewing, or making clothing, or making armor, or making tools, or building structures. Throughout the entire book, one of the things that Arendt notices and comments on is that a lot of the problems and the amount of suffering that we face in the domain of labor, for example, is fixed by our activity of work. Because we can create tools that make labor easier. Hoes, sickles. Houses allow us to live easier, right? Producing clothing allows us to maintain our warmth, allows us to maintain our biological life easier. And it's the same thing for work, too. Action ends up ameliorating the consequences that come from producing things, producing tools. We've produced the atomic bomb, for example. But it's been political action that has prevented a catastrophic geopolitical situation, not just producing more stuff, right? What's interesting about action is it isn't saved by labor or work, but it's saved by itself. Within the capacity for action lies the remedy for the consequences that action produces. And one of the most important actions that humans can engage in is forgiveness. The popularizer of forgiveness, Arendt argues, was Jesus of Nazareth, who really brought forgiveness into the mainstream of civilization. Not that he invented it necessarily, but that he popularized it. Jesus was, she says, the primary vehicle by which forgiveness became popular, normal. What's awesome about forgiveness is that it has a bunch of different effects. What forgiveness allows us to do is to release people from the bonds of the consequences that they produce through their actions. And it allows others to release us from the bonds of the consequences that we produce. If we were unable to forgive, if we were unable to release people from the bonds of the consequences of their actions, they would always be hanging over us. They would always be in the back of our mind. They might even paralyze us from acting altogether if we truly reckon with the terrible consequences of our actions and if we see them on display in the world. Only forgiveness allows us to be free to perform new actions and to start anew. Only forgiveness releases us from the consequences of our actions. Forgiveness, in some sense, wipes the slate clean. We won't forget what people do. People won't forget what we've done. But what forgiveness amounts to is basically a way of saying, I understand what you've done, and I'm not going to hold you too responsible anymore for that. I'm going to release you from those ties that are binding you. It is the opposite of vengeance, she says. Whereas forgiveness releases people from the consequences of their own action, it kind of cuts off the chain of consequences from producing more consequences. Vengeance produces more consequences instead of putting an end to them. Vengeance is not essentially liberatory like forgiveness is, Arendt thinks. Because what happens when you engage in vengeance is that you produce a new chain of consequences, which can come back to bite you in the butt, right? You produce vengeance, somebody else is going to come back and they're going to try to be vengeful. And of course, you're not going to say, okay, we're right now, we're square, right? You're going to be like, fuck you, I'm going to come back and I'm going to do something to you, right? And on it goes. Forgiveness, however, allows us to unbind each other from the consequences of our own actions. It is done primarily for the sake of the other person, but you will notice in your life when you have forgiven people that forgiveness does something for you as well. Right? As long as you are holding a grudge, your spirit is keeping something, you might say, unhealthy alive within you. Something that draws your attention back. Something that haunts you in a certain sense. Right? So forgiveness functions to relieve other people of the responsibility of the consequences of their own actions. It unbinds them from that. But it also does something for you. And that is, it unbinds you, in a certain sense, from resentment, from rumination. We can say then that forgiveness is good for the other and you. The interesting thing about forgiveness is that implicitly has this liberatory power, as we've been discussing, but it allows you, in some sense, to take a step back and respect the person for who they are, irrespective of what they've done. There is some sense in which what people do is revealing of their inner character, right? But one of the things that we know about people is that they can always surprise you, right? People can always surprise you. People can always do things that you didn't see coming. The philosopher Luce Rigori argues that we can never completely know another person because they are transcendent to us. We can't trap them in our categories and labels because who they are essentially extends beyond those things, right? I can slap a bunch of labels and categories on you, but you are not the labels and the categories, right? You're something beyond that, something with a will, something with desires that can act. What forgiveness involves, Arendt thinks, is implicitly respecting the other person for who they are, irrespective of what they've done, which allows us to see them in a new light and to treat them as if the possibility of redemption also exists for them and it also exists for us. Now, this is one action, Arendt thinks, that is necessary not only for the health of human relationships, but for the health of human society. She does not think that a successful society is going to be able to get along without sufficient forgiveness. For if we are never released from the consequences of our own actions, they're always going to hang over our heads, and we cannot really engage in concert in useful and meaningful political action. Forgiveness is key, not only to the health of our personal relationships, but also to the health of society as well, Arendt thinks. And we should work on practicing it. It's hard. It's not easy. But it's something that we need to utilize if we are going to cultivate some sense of security and stability in our political way of life. Of course, this isn't the only action that she comments on. There's also another action that we can engage in to safeguard not only our human relationships, but also society as well. I've said it once already. What do you think it is? What's another action that we can engage in besides forgiveness that is going to allow us to cultivate some security and stability in our relationships and in society generally? Do we have any business majors in here? When you buy a product or when you strike a deal, what are you doing? Yeah.
Compromise?
Right. Well, what does a compromise implicitly contain? You're using speech to express something. What does that speech mean to the other person? You're engaged in kind of either the formation of a contract, right? These are my terms. I'll do this for you. You do this for me. Contracts implicitly involve promise making. They implicitly involve both parties keeping to their word. Promise making is the other activity that we can engage in to bring stability and security to our own relationships as well as to human society. Without promise making, Arendt thinks that our society would go belly up. Because if nobody can hold anybody else to their word, not only can we not predict what other people are going to do, but we cannot trust them. And human societies depend implicitly on trust. I trust you're not going to murder me while I'm standing up here. You trust that the driver at the red light isn't just going to drive through and hit you while you're walking, when the little white flashing light appears. Human societies depend on trust. They depend on people keeping their word. And so we can combat the unpredictability of action by holding to our word and urging others to hold to their word. She talks about this in section 34. Unpredictability and the power of promise. If forgiveness has the power to shield us from the harms of the irreversibility of action, promise making has the power to lessen the unpredictability of action. Arendt says that the power and usefulness of making promises has been with us for thousands of years in covenants and social contracts. Promise making isn't just a moral activity, it's a social activity, it's a political activity. Our society is dependent strongly on various types of contracts. Social contracts, political contracts, moral contracts that we're both going to adhere to the same standard of morality generally, right? We're both not going to kill each other's family because it's fun, right? We implicitly think that we shouldn't do that and we hold each other to that. Contracts form the basis of our society in many different ways. And so we shouldn't conceptualize promise making as just some nice moral thing that we can do. No, it's actually the backbone of society. It's the backbone of human civilization. It has been for a long time. Promise making seeks to dispel two different kinds of unpredictability. There's unpredictability in human nature, and there's unpredictability, as we said before, in the consequences of actions. We'll talk about the easy one first. Consequences for our actions. Unpredictability. We do not know the kinds of effects our actions are going to have. Maybe this lecture ends up inspiring you to start a nonprofit, which then changes 1 million people's lives. We won't know until it's happened or it hasn't happened. Maybe your conversation with one friend who calls you late at night prevents them from killing themselves, which prevents their family from going through sorrow and hardship, and all of that entails. Maybe one word that you say to someone changes their life, which causes them to think and act differently in their relationships and change a whole bunch of other people's lives. There's unpredictability in acting. What promise making allows us to do is it allows us to lessen the unpredictability by saying, this is what I'm going to do, this is what my intention is, this is how things are going to be. That allows us to think and plan for the future, and not only for our own lives, relevant to our own personal relationships, but also how we look at and think of society in the future. Promise making allows us to lessen unpredictability on that front. But there is perhaps another even more important aspect of promise making, which is it lessens the unpredictability of human nature. Humans, after all, are the originators of all these actions. None of this would be the way it is without humans. Right? Your life would not be the way it is without humans doing human stuff. There is an inherent unpredictability in human nature because humans change. They live in a changing universe. Your desires change, your goals change, your intentions change. What promise making allows us to do it allows us to cultivate some stability, some security in the face of all of that change. It allows us to be secure. It allows us to plan for the future, even though your desires and your intentions might change. Because you've given your word, right? And so what promise making is seeking to do, ultimately, is cultivate some security and stability in our lives and in society generally. Along with forgiveness as well, Arendt thinks that promise-making forms the bedrock of not only politics, but also morality. She says, moral precepts arise directly out of the will to live together with others in the mode of acting and speaking. The only way that we can live amongst one another with any sense of security and stability is if there's trust, is if we hold to our word and if other people hold to their word. Arendt thinks that these two fundamental activities, forgiveness and promise-making, are necessary for our society to continually function. What is bereft in our society today is forgiveness and promise-making in many domains. Do politicians keep their word? Or do they run a platform on one thing and do another thing when they get into office? Do businessmen and CEOs always keep their word? No. They screw over other people. They try to find loopholes in tax law and in contracts, and they take advantage of those things for money. You and I don't always keep our word. But perhaps as equally as important as keeping our word is forgiveness. Forgiving other people. Because as long as we don't forgive, what ends up happening is we produce a feedback loop of somebody's actions produces some consequence or set of consequences. Those consequences end up producing certain actions which cause us to feel anger, resentment, and they cause us to lash out at other people, which produces more consequences, and we're in a worse pickle than we were before. People are just angrier and more resentful. Without sufficient levels of forgiveness and promise-making, we are not going to make it. We're not going to be able to live together. We're not going to be able to trust one another. We're not going to be able to act collectively to achieve our political ends. We'll all be grasping at straws in the dark, unable to be secure in our society, unable to trust anybody, doing things on our own. Doing things on our own does not give us enough power to change and shape the world in the way that it should be changed and shaped. And so, in conclusion, Arendt says, for society to continue to function, we need to engage in forgiveness and promise-making. Because these are what allow us to maintain and form stable relationships. Without doing this, we cannot form and maintain stable human relationships and maintain the institutions that we have and keep them in working order. If you do not trust other people in society, how are you going to move about in the world? If other people don't trust you to, say, pay you for their services, why would anybody fix anything? Why would anybody maintain the upkeep of this whole giant system that we've constructed for ourselves? That magically works. We have lights. Incredible. She discusses this on page 237. Without being forgiven, released from the consequences of what we have done, our capacity to act would, as it were, be confined to one single deed from which we could never recover. We would remain the victims of its consequences forever, not unlike the sorcerer's apprentice who lacked the magic formula to break the spell. Without being bound to the fulfillment of promises, we would never be able to keep our identities. We would be condemned to wander helplessly and without direction in the darkness of each man's lonely heart, caught in its contradictions and equivocalities. A darkness which only the light shed over the public realm through the presence of others, who can confirm the identity between the one who promises and the one who fulfills, can dispel. Both faculties, therefore, depend on plurality, on the presence and acting of others. For no one can forgive himself, and no one can feel bound by a promise made only to himself. Forgiving and promising enacted in solitude or isolation remain without reality and can signify no more than a role played before oneself. So not only does our society require forgiveness and promise-making, I would argue that our ethical practices also involve forgiveness and promise-making. Ethical behavior must also include forgiveness and promise-making. We don't have the whole story. We are not infallible. We make mistakes. To expect everybody, including yourself, to just simply do the moral thing all the time is foolish, because that ain't going to happen. Try as we might to be good people, we will make mistakes, and other people are going to make mistakes too. Life is complex, and the world is constantly changing, and we're always trying to adapt to it. Our moral analysis and our moral behavior should also include forgiveness and promise-making. The implication from all of this is that without forgiveness and promise-making, our relationships and our society would be filled with resentment, insecurity, and maybe even despair when we consider the consequences of our own actions. The way things are now does not necessitate that things are always going to be like this. Forgiveness and promise-making as examples of action which begin processes anew remind us that something new is always being brought into the world. There is always hope. There is always reason for hope. Because we possess the keys, in some sense, to one aspect of our own liberation. Just like the plethora of babies that are being born every day, who offer our society, our civilization, new possibilities, new perspectives, new ways of life, forgiveness and promise-making also offer us glimpses into the potential future that we can create if we were more patient with each other, if we were more loving, if we were more forgiving, and if we were more honest. That is why Arendt discusses it at such length in this book. She truly thinks the amazing power of these activities have gone unanalyzed. And she thinks that they play a pivotal role in our personal lives and in our social lives. So, what do you all think? Do you think forgiveness and promise-making are important? Or do you think she's exaggerating? Do you like what she's saying?
I think she's right, because if we don't forgive people and if we continue to just not see the good in people, I think we would live very negative and pessimistic lives. And like she says, we would just be resentful people. And the more you don't forgive people, the more resentful you'll become. So you'll just think everybody's after you and that kind of stuff. But I think it's important to recognize that people make mistakes, and sometimes you just have to give them another chance, or you don't have to forget what they did to you, but you could just accept what they did to you.
Anybody else? Maybe you're thinking to yourself, no, we shouldn't forgive everybody. That would be stupid. Right? Why should we think that everybody has the potential for redemption? Maybe for the sake of our own society, it's foolish to go around just forgiving people willy-nilly. Maybe we should withhold our forgiveness for a period of time, maybe indefinitely. And promise-making, whatever. Is it really that important? Yeah.
I agree with the forgiveness thing and how we should all just really try to move past things that happened to us before and just try not to hold on to certain events. But I feel for promise making, that's kind of unrealistic in a way.
You think so?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like the premise of it, and I think that's nice, but a lot of times people can't really keep their promises, and because of people making those promises and they can't follow through, they hurt the other person.
Maybe they shouldn't give their word in the first place.
Yeah.
I don't know, what percentage of people who don't keep their promises do you think actually really try hard to do it? What were you going to say?
So like, what if somebody like keeps making promises over and over again? Like, do we still forgive them? Because like, when is there a point where we stop forgiving them?
What would Jesus say?
Forgive.
Forgive, right? Don't be stupid, but forgive. Does anybody not like that view? Like, look, maybe we should withhold forgiveness sometimes.
I think you can still forgive, but it doesn't mean you have to like keep that person in your life.
Okay, say more about that.
I mean, like if someone keeps screwing you over and you like keep giving them so many chances, like you can keep forgiving them, but it's clear that they're not gonna change, and so you don't really have to keep them in your life. But you can still forgive them.
So you can be like, look, I'm not harboring you any ill will. I forgive you. But also, I'm not going to hang around you anymore. Go find somebody else to hang out with. Y'all like that kind of way of handling it? Maybe you're just a person who really wants to hold on to grudges, though. Is that so bad? Maybe you still hate Robert in the 5th grade who tripped you in the hallway and called you a name. What's so bad about that? Is it wrong morally? Is it bad practically to do that? I don't know if it's immoral. But I would venture to guess that as long as you're holding on to a grudge, you're keeping something alive that doesn't serve you. Maybe you think differently. I don't know. Of course, this is all easier said than done, right? How can you just forgive someone who does something awful to you? How can you forgive somebody who kills your child? Or assaults you? Or assaults somebody that you love? I think I could deal with getting assaulted. I don't know if I could deal with the women in my life being assaulted. That would hurt me a lot more. Do forgiveness and promise making actually play these really pivotal, important roles? Or is she just kind of, being a little extra? Yeah.
I feel like they are important, but it's just one of those things where it can't really apply to everything. Like sometimes, some people you just can't truly forgive. Like some people just don't truly deserve forgiveness. In certain cases, yeah, but if they're truly like an awful, terrible person, like they don't deserve that.
All right, so you said two different things there. You said there are instances in which we can't forgive people, and there are instances in which people don't deserve it, right? What would be an example of somebody who doesn't deserve it?
Like a rapist or a murderer, something like that.
Okay.
Someone just truly out there creating harm for people just for their pleasure.
Like intentionally?
Yeah.
Not considering anybody else's welfare, just their own, maybe. What do y'all think? Yeah.
Have you ever seen BoJack Horseman?
Yeah.
Remember that episode where that guy's on his deathbed and BoJack's like, I'm so sorry for everything that I've done for you. I'm sorry that my actions led for you to have like a bad life, and I'm sorry that you're dying of cancer. And the guy was like, well, I'm not gonna forgive you. You don't deserve to just have everything work out for you in the end. And then he dies. And that's like the episode. I feel like that's fair. You know, like not everybody deserves to be forgiven because people just want to be forgiven so that they can go on and do more bad shit.
I suppose there's a difference between forgiving someone who is really seeking to change and somebody who isn't. Maybe we'd say somebody who doesn't really care about changing. We don't need to worry about forgiving them. Anybody else agree with that? Disagree? Yeah.
I feel like going off base with everyone else is like saying it's almost like some people are asking for forgiveness for their own benefit. Like some people in prison will be like, well, if I apologize, I can get out of life. It's just like one of those things.
So that would be an example, kind of an insincere apology, right? Think about who you truly know and understand in your life. Is there anybody that you would say you truly, really know? Now think about the person who does you wrong. Do you know their life story? Do you know their motivations? Can you understand totally what drove them to do what they did? I think a lot of times we are not eager to forgive. And I think that comes from presuming that we understand or know something about the other person that we oftentimes don't. Situations are a lot more complex than they seem. Now, does that mean we should just go around forgiving everybody who does bad stuff to us? Maybe not. But I wonder how much good we could bring to the world if we leaned into the side of forgiveness rather than holding grudges. This is a little cliche, but you can think about the way that you would want to be treated, right, if you did something wrong. Would you want to be forgiven? Probably, right? Again, it's not easy to do this, especially when somebody really hurts you. But I wonder if it's an ideal worth striving for. I don't know. In any case, maybe you don't think the person is deserving of forgiveness, but maybe you are doing a good thing by forgiving them. I don't know. It depends on your ethical theory, right? Does anybody have any comments, questions? Yeah.
What I was saying for there, I think for forgiving people or being able to forgive, that really shows maturity in yourself and that you're trying to move past the issue. And even if they don't really deserve the forgiveness, but if you're able to forgive them, I think that's good.
Okay.
Like
so maybe it's not necessary, but it's an extra good thing you could do?
Yeah, like it's a step to like moving into a better direction. Like I think it's beneficial, like if you can forgive people. Like it's understandable if you don't, but I think if you want to be better or try to get better in certain things, like you should be able to forgive.
Okay. Anybody else have anything to say?
I'm so sorry. I also feel like sometimes whenever you like be the better person, like forgive someone, it's almost like you're invalidating your own feelings by saying like, oh, I guess I forgive you. Because like deep down, like, do you actually forgive them, or you only saying that to make the world better?
Yeah, I mean, there seem to be instances, right, in which we say we forgive another person when we haven't really let it go, right? And that maybe you view that as inauthentic in a way, or is even harmful to you. You know, yeah, that's an interesting point. I think that at least when it comes to living a good life, a happy life, a fulfilling life, a life of contentment, perhaps, that we should meditate on this question of forgiveness. I think it is important. I think promise making is important too. Depends on what your goals are in life, but if you want to be a good person and if you want to be treated well, maybe consider extending the olive branch first. Just a thought. Okay. All right, well, that's all I have for you today. This is the last lecture we're doing, so you don't have to study anything else after this. After Thanksgiving break, we'll come back and we will have a discussion day for this unit, and then we will have a review day. Did y'all get my announcements on Canvas? See those? Okay, good. Yeah, make sure you've submitted everything, the proper file formats, all that stuff. And sign the attendance sheet before you go, will ya? Thank you. Otherwise, yeah, have a great Thanksgiving break, everybody.